Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Phil Hammock. I am professor and chair of psychology here at UC Santa Cruz, and I'll be moderating this university forum, navigating stress, anxiety, and isolation in the midst of a pandemic. The UC Santa Cruz Forum is an ongoing series focusing on the relevance of our research to the community and to social, economic, environmental, and political issues, proudly featuring the impact of research conducted by the faculty at UC Santa Cruz. And I should mention that it's very clear that tonight's event is highly relevant. We got almost 1,000 people registered for the event. So people will be sort of coming in. If you're like me, one of your coping strategies during this pandemic has been to adopt an opportunity mindset. So I think it's an incredible opportunity that we have the UC Santa Cruz University Forum, and that we can come together. And in some ways, this information is even more accessible during the pandemic. So it's been a great opportunity to make the research that's going on at UC Santa Cruz more accessible to a broader public. So that's one good thing from the pandemic. So some housekeeping before we begin. I just want to share a few details about the event tonight. We are using a webinar tool, so there is no chat function. We will have an opportunity to answer your questions at the end of the program, and we invite you to submit your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Tonight's event will be recorded. To introduce the conversation tonight, I just want to say that as we approach 12 months of living with a global pandemic, the stress, and anxiety, and for some, the isolation is really taking its toll. So tonight, distinguished Professor Craig Haney and UC Santa Cruz alumna, Dr. Alison Holman, will join us for an important discussion about early psychological responses, loneliness, isolation, and how the distortion of time may be affecting our well-being as we negotiate a balance between the risks and human needs of social connection. So I want to first welcome our two panelists. Craig Heaney is a social psychologist and distinguished professor of psychology at UC Santa Cruz, noted for his work on the study of capital punishment and the psychological impact of imprisonment and prison isolation. He has a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's and PhD in psychology, and a JD in law from Stanford University. Over the last several decades, Professor Heaney's research has taken him inside many of the nation's most notorious jails and prisons, where he has assessed the psychological effects of solitary confinement on hundreds of incarcerated persons housed there. His research, writing, and testimony have been relied on by numerous state and federal courts to significantly change and reform harmful conditions of confinement and unconstitutional prison practices. Our second panelist is Allison Holman, a graduate of Rachel Carson College in 1989, although I imagine back then it was still called, well, I know it was still called College 8, I think, right, Allison? Allison is professor for the Sue and Bill Gross School of Nursing, a family nurse practitioner and researcher at UC Irvine. Holman earned her bachelor's degree in nursing science from San Francisco State University, bachelor's degree in psychology at UC Santa Cruz, and a PhD in health psychology from UC Irvine, as well as a family nurse practitioner certification from the California Board of Registered Nursing. Her research focuses on understanding the early post-event predictors of comorbid trauma-related mental and physical health problems. She seeks to identify predictors of contributions of and interactions between acute responses to trauma that increase vulnerability to trauma-related health problems. The ultimate goal of her research is to identify targets for early interventions to prevent trauma-related morbidity and mortality. So it's really a pleasure to have both Allison and Craig, distinguished scholars, with us here tonight. And it's really my privilege to serve as the moderator of this forum. So with that, I think I will go ahead and turn it over to Craig.
Thanks, Phil. It's a real pleasure and honor to be part of this panel. As you pointed out, this is a topic that could not be more current. It is a topic that could not be more front of mind for most of us, we're nearing almost a 1-year anniversary of learning as a country that we would be facing this pandemic, and that as February turned into March and March turned into April, that we would be locked down for the most part as a nation, and we would be subjected to living conditions that that imposed upon us, involuntarily imposed upon us, conditions of profound isolation. Isolation is a topic that I've been studying in prison systems around the country, as you pointed out in your introduction. It never occurred to me until the pandemic that the lessons that I was learning studying people who were in solitary confinement would be lessons that actually the population in general could learn from. And so I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to a very large audience of people about what isolation does to people. And also at the end of my short presentation, I'll talk a little bit about what I've learned from people who've been in solitary confinement and who have survived it, and who have survived it successfully, what they've done and how they have managed to endure this very difficult experience. So let me turn to a few slides that I want to show you by way of introducing these issues to you. We are all, in a certain sense, prisoners of isolation in ways that I know a year ago, none of us anticipated we would be. So there are 2 points that I want to make at the outset, which is that I'm going to show you some slides, and I'm going to show you some of the consequences of isolation in its most extreme and severe form. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that any of us are enduring the kinds of cruel and painful conditions of confinement that people who are in solitary confinement in our nation's prisons are undergoing. But at the same time, the second point I want to make is that there is a quality of the experience that we are having. There is a small dose of what they are experiencing that the rest of our society has been subjected to over the last year. And I do think that it is important for us to take seriously the things that are happening to us, in the same way that I've learned to take seriously the things that are happening to the prisoners whose lives that I've studied in solitary confinement. There is a science to this, and I'm going to be brief tonight in the introductory comments, and I won't go in depth to the science of it. But I will draw your attention to this article, which I am more than happy to send to any of you who are viewing this webinar who would like to receive this, which basically is a review of what the science of solitary is. Not just the science of solitary confinement, but the science of solitary and isolation and loneliness that we have been studying as psychologists and researchers over the last several decades in settings outside of prison. So if you write me at my email, which is at the bottom of this opening slide, I am more than happy to send you this article, which reviews a lot of the literature, which talks about exactly the kinds of things that we know scientifically happen to people when they are placed in conditions of social isolation, social exclusion, and experience loneliness. I said a moment ago that most of my research has been focused on people who are in prison and people who are in solitary confinement units in prison, but there's a vast literature which talks about these issues more generally, about what the consequences are of social exclusion, of loneliness, of isolation on human beings. And this is a burgeoning area of research. Over the last 20 years, people far outside prison environments have studied the adverse impacts of isolation on broad populations of people. And these studies and books, indeed, written about the extent to which human beings are social animals, and the extent to which, in the words of my colleague, Matt Lieberman at UCLA, we are wired to connect to one another. And there is a tremendous amount of research on what happens when that wiring is disconnected, when we're prevented from being in environments where we can naturally relate to one another, interact with one another, and receive social feedback from one another, precisely the kinds of conditions in varying ways we've all been subjected to over the last year. Now, solitary confinement, I want to make this very clear, is a toxic form of social isolation. And it is a form of social isolation that's imposed in addition to the already toxic environment of prison. So people who are placed in solitary confinement, the people that I work with, are people who have already endured the painfulness and the harmfulness of prison. And when we study what happens to them in solitary confinement, we're studying what's the increment of pain and suffering and damage that they endure as a result of what's unique about solitary confinement, which is the absolute deprivation of meaningful human social contact. Now, let's be clear. These are the places I go, and these are the places where I do assessments of the psychological consequences of what happens to people in solitary confinement. None of us are living in an environment like this. None of us are living in immediate environments like the men whose lives I study in cells like this, where I go to talk to them about what's happening to them in the course of being housed in solitary confinement. None of us are being overseen by armed correctional officers, which is oftentimes what happens to people who are in solitary confinement units in different prisons around the country. And needless to say, few, if any of us, hopefully none of us, are deteriorating in our immediate living conditions the way so many people who are in solitary confinement, in fact, suffer and begin to lose a grasp on who they are and what their lives mean, and indeed fight very hard to hold on to their very sense of sanity. So I want to make the distinction as I go through the consequences that we're all of us experiencing a tiny dose of what people in environments like this experience. But we are experiencing some of what is unique about solitary confinement, which is the social isolation component of it. And here are just some of the adverse psychological effects that people who are in solitary confinement endure. And this is research done over a period of decades. Some of it's mine, but much of it is done by other people, not just in the United States, but different continents, different disciplinary focus. And study after study after study shows that solitary confinement, social isolation can have a profound negative effect on human beings. And as I say here, as I alluded to earlier, the suffering imposed on people who are in solitary confinement occurs in addition to the already severe pains of imprisonment. So these are studies, mine and other people's studies, are studies that measure the added effect, the added negative, harmful effect, not just of imprisonment, but beyond imprisonment, what happens to people who are not only imprisoned, but placed in solitary confinement. In a lot of the research I've done, what we do is we contrast and compare people who are in solitary confinement, here depicted in the taller orange column, in terms of their contrast with people who are in general population prison environments. And so we measure various indices of psychological trauma. Some of them are stress related, some of them are isolation related. And you can see from this graph comparison, for example, that the sheer number of symptoms which are experienced by people who are in solitary confinement environments is nearly twice the number of symptoms experienced by people who are in general population prison environments. If you measure the intensity at which they experience these things, you find similar contrasts. They experience these things, not only more of them, which is what's depicted in this slide, but they experience them in a much greater, almost twice the intensity. Whether they're stress-related indices of psychological trauma or isolation-related symptoms of trauma, you can see that those people in orange, depicted here in orange, are much more intensely pained by and under distress and suffering from the experience of isolation, far beyond even the suffering that takes place for people who are in prison. And if you look at something that may seem like it's obvious, the difference in the extent to which they are experiencing loneliness. So on standardized measures of loneliness, you can see that, in fact, people who are in general population prisons, depicted here in the green column, actually are quite lonely. If you look at the norms for the UCLA loneliness scale, people who are in general population prisons are lonely. They're removed from their normal social networks. They don't get many visits. They are unable really to connect with people that they knew or were close to in the outside world. But when you put those people in isolation, the loneliness, in fact, intensifies to a much greater and indeed pathological level. Now, people who survive solitary confinement, who come out of solitary confinement, either to be released back into a general population prison, or among the people that I study who come back into free society once they've been in solitary confinement, oftentimes continue to suffer from the consequences of having been in solitary confinement. So you see here, for example, they're significantly more likely to suffer from PTSD after they've been released from prison. And indeed, they're not only more likely to suffer from PTSD, but they are more vulnerable to actually mortality. They're more likely to die from suicide, homicide, or opioid abuse or overdose in the first year following their release, in part because they have been forced to adapt to an environment in the absence of people and without assistance to transition into a world where they're expected to be able to interact with people and to fit back into a society where social interaction is part of our normative day-to-day life. It's a difficult transition, and many of them have an extraordinarily difficult time making that transition once they leave solitary confinement. Now, again, I want to bring us back to the fact that none of us are experiencing these kinds of extreme, toxic kinds of conditions. So what I've just talked about applies to people who are in prison solitary confinement units, a tiny dose of which we're grappling with. But I also want to underscore the extent to which social isolation is a form of not only painful existence, but potentially traumatic existence. And the seriousness of this potential trauma needs to be taken in this larger context of what we know it does to people. And in fact, you may have seen a lot of media coverage of precisely this issue. We're now understanding that that in addition to the medical challenge of COVID-19, there is a psychological challenge which can have significant medical consequences. Isolation is not only psychologically painful, but it is medically dangerous. And so, you know, the New York Times article reminds us that at the same time it is important for us to isolate, the damage of solitude is being overlooked. Families and advocacy groups understand this. They're seeing the consequences of isolation. And they say, and I would agree, that widespread lockdowns are necessary to protect people from the virus, but also the facilities, and I would say the larger society, must now confront a growing physical and mental toll of social isolation as the pandemic shows no sign of abating. So this is a sort of a dire picture I've just painted for you. So let me talk now about a couple of things that I've learned from people who have successfully survived solitary confinement. These are the people who, in my experience, and the hundreds of people who I've interviewed and assessed in these kinds of environments, do the best and come out of this profound social isolation much more able, much more resilient, much more successful in making the adjustment from having been isolated to now returning to a meaningful social world. The first thing, and it's sort of implicit in what I've said all along, but I learned this from the people that I work with in solitary confinement units. It's important that all of us take the signs and the symptoms of distress seriously. These are not indications that there's anything wrong with us personally, that we're suffering from a form of mental illness. We are, in fact, adapting to an abnormal condition of daily life. And of course, it is producing signs and symptoms of distress in us, but they shouldn't be ignored. They should be taken seriously. We should think about ways to address them, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And certainly in extreme cases, just as with people who are in solitary confinement, if you find yourself being overwhelmed by depression, being overwhelmed by anxiety, then it's important to consult people who can provide professional counseling or therapy. Neither Professor Holman nor I are therapists, so we're providing you with insights based on our research. But to the extent to which some of you are tuned into this webinar because it is feeling to you as though it is getting too much and you really can't take it, then it is important, I think, for you to take this distress that you're feeling seriously. It's not your fault. It's the fault of the conditions under which you're living, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't seek help where help seems like it's appropriate. The other technique that people that I worked with in solitary confinement who successfully survived it have taught me is that it is important to do anything and everything you can to create and adhere to a schedule of activities and commitments. Prisoners in solitary confinement talk to me about the danger of submitting to the void, to the emptiness of it all. They counsel, the successful prisoners that I work with counsel other prisoners, don't give into it. Create a structure for yourself, even though it is artificial, even though it is not tied into the ordinary rhythms of our normal social life, but create a structure of activities, make commitments sometimes that you're making only to yourself because you have only yourself to be accountable to, but then try to adhere to those commitments. In other words, try to keep as normal a schedule in your life as you possibly can. That's a challenge. I won't speak for you, I'll speak for myself. It's proven incredibly challenging, but I think it's important to try to do as we try to survive this 1 year and counting of the COVID lockdown. The other thing they've taught me is to do anything and everything they can to maintain social contacts and connections. In this environment, of course, I've added the importance of doing it safely, but it is important to reach out as much as possible. The danger point I've learned with the people that I work with in solitary confinement is when they begin to say, you know, it's too much of a hassle to deal with people. It's too much of a hassle to answer letters or to make phone calls or to get visits from my family members, because that's the point at which the isolation is winning. And people who successfully survive solitary confinement underscore for me the importance of doing anything you can to maintain as many social contacts and connections you can, despite the impediments that have been placed before you. And the final point, and I don't mean to end on a down note, but it would be remiss of me not to point this out, which is that we all need to realize that when this is over, and hopefully it will be over soon, it's not going to be entirely over, which means that there is going to be a period of transition, that we don't go one day from being locked down and isolated from people and not being able to connect to the people that we love and care about, from whom we've been distanced for so long, and the next day simply return to normal social existence and normal social interactions. There will be a period of adjustment. There will be a period of adjustment where we are going to have to rekindle those nerve endings that have been dormant for the last year. We're going to have to learn how to interact with each other again. We're going to have to learn how, incidentally, to be comfortable with each other again, because we have been for a year in the absence of other people. We've adapted and adjusted to that, some of us better than others, some of us more painfully than others. But when the time comes when we can interact again, there is going to be a period in which we're going to have to relearn those things, regain those social skills that have atrophied, necessarily atrophied as a result of the experiences that we've had over the last year. So that's the point on which I will end. And now it's a pleasure for me to turn things over to my colleague, Professor Holman, to talk about her research. Thank you.
Unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Fantastic talk. Thank you, Craig. That was a really, really excellent discussion of isolation and loneliness. I really appreciate all that you have said. So good evening, everybody. My name is Allison Holman, and I am a researcher, a professor at UC Irvine, as Dr. Hammock mentioned, and I am conducting studies on collective trauma, and one of the collective traumas I'm studying is the COVID pandemic. So let me get started. So tonight, what I'm going to talk to you about is about some research I've been doing on loneliness, the COVID-19 time warp, what I call the COVID-19 time warp, and mental health in a representative sample of Americans. So to start, I want to start by just pointing out that our perceptions of time are like a window that we have onto the world. We create order with time. How time passes in our lives has a powerful force in terms of what we see, how we perceive the world around us, and how we behave in the world around us. And as individuals, as human beings, it's really important for us to keep some sense of continuity between our past, which is where we get our identity, our present, which is where we live in the moment, and our futures, which is a place where we have a sense of purpose and a goal, someplace to go to. And having a balance between our past, our present, and our future in our life is really important for our mental well-being. And it's a critical part of our mental well-being. And I would argue, actually, that what you were talking about, Craig, in terms of the impact of isolation is in part because the sense of time is probably disrupted in many of the prisoners that you've spoken to. And we can talk about that at some point. But our sense of time is also very powerfully shaped by the experiences we have in life, and especially ones that are stressful or traumatic. Some of you may recall back in 2012, there was a large mass shooting in Aurora, Colorado. And we had one of the survivors of that said it felt like forever, long enough to last a lifetime. So that one event, that period of time felt like it lasted a lifetime. Nicole Hockley, the mother of Dylan Hockley, who was one of the young boys who was killed in the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting in 2012, said, "At times it feels like only yesterday, and at others it feels like many years have passed." Some of you may be experiencing some of those feelings now with regard to the pandemic and the year 2020. So what does all this mean in the age of COVID? Well, I would argue that 2020 serves as a banner year for demonstrating how much our experiences of time can shape, how much our experiences can shape our sense of time. For many people, the pandemic has been like running into a brick wall that stops our movement through time in its tracks. In fact, many people are experiencing changes in their sense of time that are consistent with a construct or with something I call temporal disintegration, which is a process in which our sequential thinking is impaired. The here and now is isolated from the continuity of time. Examples of this that some of you may be experiencing are feeling as though time has slowed down or stopped, feeling like you're caught up in the present moment, or feeling as though one doesn't have a future ahead of them. These are all elements of having this sense of having a disintegration of those temporal sequences, that continuity between past, present, and future. So, and these changes in how we perceive the world, how we perceive time passing in our worlds, have powerful impact on our mental health as well. And I've done several studies in which I've looked at this. And in my dissertation research, which was on a California wildfire in the aftermath of the 1993 firestorms in Southern California, we found that temporal disintegration was associated with much higher levels of psychological distress and depression and PTSD type symptoms. We also find in a study I did after 9/11, it's associated with worrying about the future. So having a sense of worry or fear about the future. And so we know that this change in our perceptions of time are associated with mental health symptoms. But we also know that our sense of time can also have an impact on our social relationships, who we connect with and how we connect with them. For example, it appears that time perceptions and social relationships actually have a somewhat of a reciprocal relationship with one another. For example, negative social interactions that we have with people can actually fuel and undermine people's perceptions about the future, but also keep them focused on the past at the same time. And this can then have an impact on how they relate to the people around them. Whereas on the other hand, positive social interactions like a supportive environment can promote more future thinking. It can encourage people to think more positively about the future and then be more open to engaging with others in that future. So we have this relationship between time and the social relationship as well. But COVID itself, when we talk about the future, COVID itself has brought a major challenge to us in terms of understanding our future. It's an invisible, read anxiety provoking, ambiguous, more anxiety and more worry, threat that has rendered our futures uncertain. It's changed how we connect with the most important people in our lives. And it's created a situation where the requirements for social distancing conflict with that natural desire that we all have to seek out friends and family in the times of stress. So we're all feeling the stress, but unable to actually do the things that we might naturally do in a social setting to get the support we need. And so what has this meant for our lives? Well, looking at the research on COVID and social isolation, there's a lot of mixed findings out there that have been published. There's some studies, many studies that show increases in or high levels of loneliness among older adults during the pandemic, very consistent with some of what Dr. Haney was discussing. There's also higher loneliness in younger people than in other age groups, which to some people is rather surprising. Why would younger people experience greater loneliness than older people? Well, there's lots of reasons for that, and we can talk about that. A few studies show that there's no changes in loneliness. A study in Israel suggested that. And some people are saying that there's really no changes in younger or older people. But a lot of the studies that have been done, I'm going to pull something that a lot of researchers say, but a lot of those studies are not very strong. They're not very well done. They tend to use unrepresentative samples of individuals who are self-selecting into the sample. So you could get the most distressed people in there. You could get the people who are doing the best in there. They tend to use online survey samples. And again, this is with unrepresentative samples. Many of them are at single time points, so they don't follow people over time. And many of them have been done early in the pandemic rather than looking at things as they've evolved over time in the pandemic. So to get more meaningful information, one of the things that we need to be able to do is we need to be able to look at these questions in a prospective way. So you look at people find samples where you can get information on people before the event, the major trauma that you're experiencing. And then you follow them over time. You get immediate response data and then you follow them. And this is what we've been doing in in response to a variety of collective traumas, 9/11, Boston Marathon bombing, Orlando nightclub shooting, and now COVID. And you get representative samples of the population you're looking at. So we have typically used representative samples from online panels that are probability-based. So we end up being able to make draw conclusions about the American population. And then finally, another thing that's really important in this research is that we have a more comprehensive approach where we actually look at a variety of important experiences that people are having during that collective trauma that will help us understand how are they going to cope in the future? How are they coping over time? So toward this end, my colleagues and I, oh boy, I just froze. Hold on just a second. There we go. Toward this end, my colleagues and I have started a study back in March using the AmeriSpeak panel, which is from NORC at the University of Chicago. And the AmeriSpeak panel had the people in our sample had provided information to NORC about their mental and physical health in late 2018 and all of 2019. Then we had the pandemic come, and it was March 13th when then President Trump declared it as an emergency in the US. And we went out into the field within 5 days. We had a large sample of over 6,500 who we split into 3 cohorts, each having a 10-day period, a sequential 10-day period, so that we could see how are people adjusting over time. So we have over 2,000, like 2,100, over 2,100 in each of these 3 cohorts that we watched over that first month after the pandemic, after the declaration of emergency. What did we find? We found, as we expected, that the rates of acute stress and depression across the cohorts was going up sequentially. We basically saw that each cohort had a higher level of stress symptoms as well as depression symptoms over time. I want to point out, I don't have a slide for this, and I apologize for that, but I want to point out that loneliness was doing the same thing. We measured loneliness in that study using the UCLA 3-item loneliness measure scale, and we found that loneliness was doing the exact same pattern here as what we're seeing here. So then what we did was back in September, late September, we went back into the field and we wanted to reassess where people were. We wanted to find out, after all of this, after all of the things that we had been through, the various forms of stress, including not just the pandemic, but of course the pandemic brought with it the economic downturn, a crisis of people not having enough food to feed their families, et cetera. And we also had a racial reckoning in this country with the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. So we had a whole series of what my colleagues and I call cascading collective crises. And these cascading crises over that period of time had an impact on people's lives in various ways. Well, we wanted to assess and understand what are people experiencing here. So we went back out in the field at the end of September, and this was after over 200,000 Americans had died from COVID-19. In this survey, we had an excellent completion rate. Over 88% of our sample responded. So we have like something in the order of like 5,700 people in this particular wave. And we measured at that time, we measured the temporal disintegration that I was talking about earlier, that loss of sequence in time. And we measured loneliness again, we measured the depression subscale again, and we also measured our 10-item measure of worries about the future again. What did we see? Interestingly, we saw that the worries about the future actually went down significantly between the time 1 and the time 2, which surprised me a little bit. I would have expected it to go up, but there's lots of possible reasons for this. But look at depression in the middle, the green one, you see that depression went up, as did loneliness. So both depression and loneliness were significantly increasing over that 6-month period of time. I then wanted to try to understand, how is loneliness, how is this change in loneliness that people were experiencing over this 6 months associated with people's sense of time? Was time involved? Was this temporal disintegration at all affected by the loneliness that people were having? And in fact, what I found was I did find that change in loneliness was indeed associated with temporal disintegration in September, when we went back and measured it in people. And that was associated with people's worries about the future, as well as their depression. I didn't put the depression slide in here as well, too, but we have both of those outcomes are significantly associated with temporal disintegration, which we see as being predicted by a change in loneliness between wave 1 and wave 2 in our study. So it's a really important issue to think about. How is loneliness, what is this loneliness doing to us when people are living alone, and how does that disorient people and make it more difficult for them, that lack of social contact, make it difficult for them to feel that sense of continuity in their lives from their past, their present, and into their futures? What does it do when people have that sense of loss of a future, which I think many people did especially in the early aftermath of the pandemic? People's sense of future was in question. Many people, young people especially, I especially worry about young people, because when you have a sense that your future is in danger or in question, it makes people wonder, some people might go so far as to say, what's it worth living for? So there's a lot of concern that can come when a person becomes isolated and starts questioning what's going on with my future, what's going on with my life, and feeling that loneliness, that lack of connectedness to other people. So in terms of conclusions, the COVID time warp is very real. And it is definitely linked with loneliness and changes in loneliness over time. What we're finding is that this loneliness and these altered time perceptions in COVID are likely, I would say, they are likely to usher in a wave of mental health problems with implications for physical health, because we know that both depression and worrying are associated with greater risk of cardiovascular disease. And then to bring us back to a place of what can we do about this, I think that the time change, the temporal perceptions in COVID that are probably, I would guess, the most damaging are the feelings that people may have about not having as strong a future as they hoped they would, and not feeling a sense of control that goes with knowing where your future is going. And so I would argue that one of the best things we can do to try to help people in this situation is to help people regain a little bit of a sense of control over their future, so that we can mitigate these risks that I think are likely to be coming down the pike for a lot of Americans. And one of the ways of doing something like that is to encourage people to make small goals. Take a small goal that you take into tomorrow or the next day, and engage in behaviors that are going to get you to that one small goal. Instead of thinking, 10 years from now or 15 years from now, think smaller, but have those goals, have that little bit of a future, and encourage people to get support from each other as they're aiming toward those goals. That's just a little tidbit that I wanted to share, because I think that that's really critical for mental health, that people have that sense of being able to regain just a little modicum of control in their lives and over their futures. In terms of future plans, we are going back into the field in the spring of this year to look at physician-diagnosed mental and physical health problems again. So we're going to have a follow-up, and then planning to examine how perceptions of the future and are linked at all to mental and physical health outcomes over time, and how the temporal disintegration and loneliness is impacting well-being over time. And then finally, one of my other goals is to be able to examine these time and loneliness issues in different racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups, to see if there are differences in how people are perceiving the changes in time and perceiving the loneliness, and how those might interact to impact people's well-being over time within different racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. So I want to say thank you to everybody for being here, and I'm going to thank my colleagues at the University of California, Irvine, and I want to thank you. I happen to be somebody who loves puppies and dogs, so puppy pictures are actually good for you. Looking at puppy pictures can be relieving of stress, believe it or not. And I want to end by saying, here are some of the coping strategies with COVID-19 that are strongly recommended by the National Institute of Mental Health. I wanted to put that up there for everybody to see, so that if anybody in the audience wants to know, you can connect with the National Institute of Mental Health and get more information about ways to cope with the pandemic. And finally, I just added on here, there's a couple of places that I would recommend that people go online. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, has many resources on their page about coping with COVID and how to get help immediately. I also want to point out that there's the crisis text line, which is a place where you can go if you're in crisis, and you just text home to 741-741 and a live person will respond via text in case you don't feel like picking up a phone and calling a crisis line that way. So I'll end with that and say thank you to everybody for being here and for listening.
Thank you so much, Allison and Craig. That was really wonderful and such a great opportunity, as I said at the outset, to have this experience of having both of you here, experts on these topics and their implications for COVID and our gradual emergence, hopefully, from it. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, as we know now, and that certainly gives us meaning. So I just want to encourage everyone, if you arrived a little bit late, to use the Q&A feature to ask questions, and I'll now moderate some questions for our panel, our distinguished panel. And I do want to start with one of my own, just to kind of get things going. And here's what it is, because this didn't quite come up, and I really want to hear both your takes on this. So I've noticed that, part of the experience of isolation and social disconnection has been the experience of living in different narrative realities, by which I mean people have been living different pandemics. So at the very beginning, I think there was this real sense of solidarity, and we're all in this together, and everything's shut down and everyone's taking it seriously. And the administration in Washington was, even the administration in Washington was having daily briefings. And then it sort of dispersed, right? And then it seemed like people started to kind of live different pandemics, telling themselves different stories about the pandemic. Some people barely left home. Others started to sort of forego public health guidance and travel or gather, I noticed. And some fell into the politicization of the pandemic. So I'm wondering how either of you think about this divergence in experience, and how that has complicated the experience, or maybe exacerbated the experience of stress and isolation, and how also you think as we get out of this, how we're going to deal with that difference, that division that sort of ended up happening with the pandemic. Can either of you or both of you maybe comment on that for a minute, and then again we'll start taking questions from the audience shortly.
Sure, Craig.
Well, Phil, as you know better than any of us, common narratives are constructed through common experiences and social interactions, and the sharing of information. And I think that's really what the one problematic aspect of this disconnection has been. We don't have those day-to-day kinds of exchanges of information that allow us to construct a narrative or remind us of the narrative that we share. And so people, in fact, have created their own way of dealing with this. There hasn't, I don't want to politicize this, but let's be frank, there hasn't even been a national narrative of public health around this, let alone how to adapt to this on a day-to-day basis. There really hasn't been any leadership. There hasn't been anybody providing a real understanding for what we all are going through. And hopefully that's about to change, or maybe in the process of changing. But I agree with you. That's part of the disruption. Again, to go back to my research with people who are in prison, I mean, what they will tell you when they get out is that they don't believe anybody understands them anymore, because they haven't shared any experiences with anybody, and they feel awkward around people. people in solitary confinement have said to me, there's a space now between me and everybody else, and I don't know how to bridge that. And some of that space is a narrative space of commonality, of experience and connectedness and relationship. And when you don't have the opportunity to nurture that, it begins to fray, and in some instances it disappears. And so the other part of your question was what happens when we get back. And I think hopefully what happens is that these skills that have atrophied and this narrative, these shared narratives that have frayed, begin to re-strengthen, and we reconnect. But I also suspect that there will be some of them that won't. I mean, that some relationships will be lost. Sometimes, we want to be helpful here. We don't want to be present a gloomy picture, but I mean, this is going to be a challenge to reconnect with each other in the meaningful, vibrant ways that we once did, given this long period of disconnection. So it is going to be a task, and I think we should be prepared for it, for the challenge.
Yeah, I would say that, so in our research, one of the things that we looked at the impact of conflicting information in the media, and how that was associated with our mental health outcomes. And I bring this up because what you're describing is dual messaging, right? Different messages. My message is that COVID's nothing, right? It's just like the flu. It's, drink hydroxychloroquine and I'm going to be fine, or whatever it might be. My message is here. Oh no, my message is, if we have to wear masks, we have to do a double mask, we have to wear gloves, very different worlds. And I think it's really important to understand that the fact that Americans experienced so much conflicting information, that information was associated with making people feel worse, because basically you don't know who to trust. You don't know who to believe. And so this is why one of the things that I think is really important in this now, as we move forward as a country under a new administration, is that we try to have as unified a messaging system as possible, so that the state and local and national agencies that are responsible for messaging public health things to the public need to have a consistent message, a message that lets people know, we have, here are the things that we need to do. We're going to be honest with you and all of that. So I think that's a really important issue. The other thing I just want to point out, in terms of just the sense of how the disruption of this isolation, how much this isolation can disrupt our sense of time. And one way to help address those differences is to help encourage people to draw from strengths they've had in the past, things that they've done in the past that have helped them cope with these kinds of things, and ask them to use those strengths to move into a future and to imagine that next future, even if it's a small future, as I said earlier. And I think by doing some of that, if we can have that presence of mind to be that way with each other, regardless of how we're experiencing the details and how much we may agree or disagree about exact details, we can help people kind of bring their lives back together. And I guess I'm trying to say that because I think maybe that would help us bridge some of those differences that we're having.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
Well, let's take some questions from the audience, and I'll go sort of chronologically in how they were posed. So from Gina, Gina asked, I'm curious, when you refer to isolation, I think this is for Craig, would you include families in this? And actually, this was getting to a question I had about like pods or bubbles or family. You know, we sort of have these more intimate units that we've constructed during the COVID era. So Gina's question is overlapping with this a little bit. So Gina wants to know, I'm curious, when you refer to isolation, would you include families in this? For example, if a family of four, 2 adults, two kids are isolating, do you feel the children will still incur potential damage, or does their family unit allow for enough interaction? Or another example is 4 roommates. So Gina says, I guess I'm trying to understand the depth of isolation that determines concern.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll just say, and I like to hear what Allison has to say about this as well. I would say that, of course, that's better than a single person living by him or herself. But it also is not the same quality or extent of normal day-to-day social interaction on which we typically depend. So children, for example, are interacting with other children, and they're learning about themselves through social interactions with their peers, not exclusively, sometimes for better or worse, not exclusively with their parents. And so that there's a limitation to the extent to which a single family can provide the extent of meaningful social interaction that children would otherwise need. Now, again, I mean, I want to underscore that's certainly better than not having that kind of interaction. Interaction is always better, but we shouldn't mislead ourselves into thinking that you don't have to be watchful of some of the potential negative effects of what really ends up being, for children especially, I think, an isolating experience. Isolating in the sense that they simply can't see their peers, they can't learn from their peers, they can't exercise their social skills in age-appropriate ways in the way that they typically would.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I don't think I have anything more to add to that. I think paying attention to kids, especially, and understanding the unique developmental needs that children have at each time, you know, at different phases in their lives. It's not the same. I mean, it's good. I agree. It's really important to have some people that you're connecting with and getting hugs from and, you know, feeling close to, but it's not the same if you don't have the life experience of being in school or playing with your friends and whatnot.
Yeah.
And I can see
You know,
this play out.
I was just going to say, Allison just touched on something that I think is implicit in what both of us said. I mean, she really did a brilliant job talking about the dimension of time and time experiences. The other dimension she just touched on is, I think, also important for us to acknowledge, which is isolation oftentimes is accompanied by the absence of caring human touch. So many of us, certainly people who are living literally by themselves, have not only experienced social isolation, but they've experienced the absence of caring human touch. And that's something that families living together or people in a pod can overcome. And it's not an insignificant deprivation, incidentally. So it's in solitary confinement, it's a component to solitary confinement. And as I say, those of us who have been living, I haven't been, but many people have been living alone, literally alone. They've been deprived of meaningful social contact. Their time distortion, as Allison points out, is having an impact on them. And they've not been in a position to touch anybody in a caring way. These are forms of deprivation that are profound.
I agree.
I want to make a plug for puppies or animals, as Allison noted at the end as well. We didn't talk about that. The number of people who have gotten animals, myself included, and the impact that can have is something. Yeah. A colleague recently joked with me that the dogs are winning the pandemic because they've got their owners there. They're getting into nice homes. They're never alone,
Right.
Right.
But, okay, so let's see. The next question we have is from April. And I think this came in around sort of the end of your presentation, Craig. So April says, I'm appreciating the last point of being familiar and comfortable again, relearning the social skills that have atrophied. I feel it myself, April says. Any tips for that? Like how we can do that, how we can start to relearn?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the suggestions I made in terms of surviving this was to do anything and everything you can to try to prevent the really significant amount of atrophy that otherwise might take place. So even, the kinds of social interaction that we've all learned to use and not necessarily become comfortable with or really or really appreciate, but nonetheless, they're interactions. The interaction we're having is an interaction. We're using social skills. It's not in quite the same way we would if we were on a panel together and there was a live audience here, but this is a social interaction, albeit a two-dimensional one. So, and I, as much as I dislike the experience of Zoom, I encourage people to engage in it. We have, our family has family Zooms that are on a regular time. And, we have family members that are all over the country, and every Sunday night at 6 o'clock, bless them all, they're all on a family Zoom from different time zones and with different schedules and different contingencies and challenges. They all show up. And, we've done various other things like that. Reach out to your friends. Propose a happy hour with your friends where you get together, and drink a glass of wine together, and in the way that you once did in person. These things are not total substitutes for the real thing, but they're certainly better than nothing. So that when it comes time for you to reconnect to that family member or that friend, it's not as though you haven't seen them or tried to interact with them for a year. But rather those connections are still there. Those social skills are still there. You just need to get better practice at it. The worst case scenario is to pull back from it, to say, this is awkward. This isn't the real thing. I don't want to do it. I hate Zoom. I'm not sure how it works. The hell with it all. And I think that's a potentially problematic maladaptation to this, because that's going to be very, very difficult to overcome when ultimately we're back in a more normal kind of social interaction and environment where we connect with each other in a face-to-face and person-to-person way.
Yeah. One of the things I'd like to emphasize too is this pandemic, the degree to which this pandemic has torn people apart from others, and sort of made it hard to interact with other people in our areas. It's taking a toll on our social fabric. And, we live in a country where we are encouraged to think about our own individual selves. It's, the American ethos is one of individualism, rugged individualism, and all of that. And I want to encourage people to take a different perspective. I want to encourage people to think about the social responsibilities that we all have. Because as Craig brilliantly brought out in his talk, we are all connected to one another, and we cannot live in the world without those connections. So remembering that and thinking about, well, what can I do? Maybe you have a neighbor who is a healthcare provider and is working four 12-hour shifts a week in a row and is having a hard time dealing with the stress of the work, plus having to go grocery shopping or having to do whatever. Maybe you can offer to help that person with a meal or with some groceries or with something in a socially distanced, in a physically distant way, but a socially connected way. And by thinking about how we engage with our neighbors, with our friends, with the people in the circles of our lives, thinking about that and really taking time to reach out and do something, not only is that good for helping to rebuild the social fabric, but it's also good for your own physical and mental health. We know that kind of pro-social behavior is good for you. So it's good for you. It helps rebuild the social fabric. It helps make that other person feel stronger, so they're going to be able to help lift other people up. It's a win-win. all around. And so doing even a small thing, I think, to help somebody else is worthwhile, is really worthwhile. And so practicing those skills in whatever ways you can.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's going to be really hard is being in crowds. Again, even if you're a person that didn't mind crowds, I think that because we can do all the things that you've both really nicely suggested, and still that experience is going to be really foreign and really kind of, and just for my own personal, because I'm someone who loves crowds normally, I think I'm just going to have to take it a little slow. I mean, like just kind of baby steps. I think that's going to be my strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting down and eating a dinner in a restaurant is gonna feel like a big step, I think, and a welcome one. That.
Well, I have people I work with, Phil, who've come out of prison, who've come out of isolation units, and who call me from the parking lot of supermarkets, grocery stores, where they have panic attacks, waiting in line, and they just it's overwhelming. There's no rhyme or reason to it. People bump into you, they cut in front of you with their carts. You have to wait in line, and they just run out of the grocery store. So again, these are extreme cases, but the point is they're underscoring to readjust to and reconfigure to get back to what was once normal for us. And indeed, not only normal, but we actually sought it out. I mean, you just said a moment, you like to be in crowds. It probably won't feel quite that, warm and fuzzy the very first time you're in one.
Yes.
Well, great. Okay. Well, here's a question from Ruth. Ruth asks, what are the effects of our pandemic experiences on those who are already suffering from mental illness or trauma?
Well, neither Allison nor I are psychotherapists, but I think we both can say the obvious here, which is, and this is true even, in prison. Many of the people who end up in solitary confinement units are placed there because they have pre-existing mental illness, and they violate the rules and regulations of the prisons because of their mental illness, and the prison, not sensitive to the underlying mental illness, places them in a form of disciplinary punishment. So I see this problem all the time, and there is every reason to be very concerned about what is happening to people who had pre-existing mental health conditions who are not being treated in a meaningful or effective way in society at large. There's nothing about isolation which makes mental illness better. People may be able to survive it, but the general pattern is that people suffer more if they're mentally ill, and the risk of decompensation or deterioration is high, especially if people have pre-existing panic or anxiety disorders, or if they have pre-existing depression syndromes, and suicidality in conditions of isolation is exacerbated significantly. So it's a mental health crisis in many ways for all of us, but it is an acute mental health crisis for the people who have pre-existing mental illness.
Yeah, I mean, I would reiterate that, and what we're seeing is that rates of suicide are going up. Suicidal acts, if not completions, are going up, and it's very sad. It's very sad to see.
And I would think maybe some negative coping strategies, like maybe more substance use. I don't know if you've seen an uptick in that. I feel like casually, I've seen some data on that,
Yeah.
And there's an uptick in crime in certain areas and certain kinds of crime. Right. That we have to look at the statistics and figure out exactly how much and where and why, but it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect that as the social fabric is fraying and fraying more in some places than others, that people are reacting to that. They're under tremendous economic pressure. and the kinds of normal social contextual things that kept us grounded, kept our behavior in control. Those kinds of things have eroded. So there's much less pressure from the social space in which we live to keep boundaries clear.
Yeah.
And I think we're beginning to see some of the impact of that.
Well, here's a question from Mary that kind of gets us actually kind of right to the present moment, or maybe to get you to think a little bit about the near future, which is about the vaccine. So Mary asks, how you think the vaccine might affect people's coping strategies. And I kind of interpreted that as like, the person gets the vaccine or is about to get the vaccine, like maybe how this turning point might shift their experience.
I actually think that it's going to depend in part on the person's sort of their worldview, but I would say that the vaccine is offering everybody a glimmer of hope for the future. It's giving us a path. It's kind of doing something that we've lived for many, many, many months without, which is that sense of what is the path to a future that is livable. And the vaccine is a path toward that livable future. And to the extent that we can get as many people vaccinated as possible, as fast as possible, we, I think, can help restore in individuals a sense of a future, even if it's a small sense of a future, even if it may not be, 25 years from now, even if it's just, 3 months from now, or a month from now, or even a week from now. The fact that we're starting to have this path created through the vaccination programs is going to, I think, have a positive impact on people's mental health and well-being. And I think that's going to be even more so for the people who actually get the vaccine. For people who choose not to get the vaccine, they may have their reasons. I'm sure they do, but they're still going to be protected when more people do get it. So ultimately, it's a win-win, as many people getting vaccinated.
It's only a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've noticed just a little bit of a psychological change within myself, just starting to hear more and more people getting it. It's this feeling of hope. There's a future, to get back to Allison's thoughts. Well, this is from Alexis. This is really interesting. Alexis says, in other times, I've enjoyed life most when time is like an accordion.
Mm-hmm.
It speeds up and slows down, expands and contracts. Alexis asks, are there ways in which perceptions of time can work for us during the pandemic and isolation?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's, what I was talking about was temporal disintegration, where people are losing that continuity from past, present to future, but reshaping and rebuilding our sense of time. And I really appreciate, was it Alexis? The idea of the accordion and speeding up and slowing down and speeding up and slowing down, because that's what a lot of people are experiencing during the pandemic. We'd have things would just kind of go by so slowly. Then all of a sudden we'd get through a week and realize, my God, how many things have happened this week? It feels like 10 years, right? And so that experience is very normal. But I would say that to the extent that people can do what I was suggesting earlier, which is to do something, it takes a conscious action. It's a choice that we need to engage with in ourselves, which is to set a path for ourselves or for the people we love or for our family. Here's a few things that we can do in the next few days to set as goals for ourselves, to help us rebuild the path we want toward the future we want. And so, yeah, you can deliberately do those things, and to the extent that you feel the energy and ability to go quickly through some of them, you can. And then you might want to slow down. So there you have your accordion. You know, you're going to go at the pace that you can. But one of the most important pieces of this is respecting your own needs in the situation, and being able to say, okay, I can do this more quickly now. Oh, maybe now I can't. I need to respect my own boundaries in this situation, not push myself too hard, but acknowledge that my goal is for tomorrow, and that's good enough to go to tomorrow, right? That's good enough for me. Maybe tomorrow I'll feel differently, and I'll be able to say, I'm going to go 5 days. I'm going to set a goal 5 days from now. So you can do that and do it with the people you love, and do it with your community, you know, to the extent that you can create those, as I was saying before, connecting with others to help weave that social fabric back together with some short and maybe longer term goals for the community, you know, through Zooms, as Craig was pointing out, through whatever, you know. I would say, yeah, there's ways that you can use time deliberately, build time back into your life, a continuity of time. And one of the things, I mentioned this earlier, but I'm just going to reiterate it now. We all have a past. We've all coped with stuff. We've all got strengths in coping with things. So what are your strengths? What can you bring from your past into your present moment that will help take you toward that next future step that you want to take? So everybody, helping people think about that for themselves, thinking about that for yourself, and then reweaving time into your life and into a continuity of time that can help you, and it can help the people around you. So I would argue that's a way to do it.
I think, you know, just to piggyback on that, I think that this accordion metaphor is a really eloquent way of describing how we're affected by time. But I think you know, to just interpret a bit of what Allison just said, I think it's better if we're playing the accordion rather than the accordion playing us. And we want it, to the extent to which we can, we want to be in control of time as much as we can. There are times when we want to let go and we want to let time be free, but that's a decision. Right. And then there are times when we want time to speed up. But again, I think if we're in control of it, and a lot of what both Allison and I have been saying is this notion of structuring time, of creating goals, even if they're very modest goals. I think that's part of gaining control of that accordion, and having it work for you rather than time kind of overwhelming you, or time dictating you, or getting lost in time and then berating yourself for not having done more or thought more about how you could have used the time. So be cognizant of your own managing of your own time as best you can, with the understanding that it's challenging to do. I mean, that's part of the reason we're talking about this so much, is because it is so difficult to do in a pandemic where our time is not structured for us by social interaction and by the obligations in the larger world that we would ordinarily be engaged in.
Yeah. And if I may say one more quick thing to what Craig was just saying, which is that this idea that sometimes people engage in not very nice discussions with themselves about their behavior. I think it's important to be very respectful and very kind to ourselves and how we speak to ourselves about how we're dealing with this, and not engage in that kind of what I call negative self-talk, that negative, you know, like you were saying, berating ourselves for not achieving what we want to achieve in such a short time. Hey, that's why it's important to be realistic about what you can do and how, in what time frame, but to be in charge of that and to say, this is realistic for me. I know this is where I am, and I know this is where I can go in the next whatever time frame. But being nice to yourself, really important. No self-trash, no self-trashing.
Oh, sorry. I think part of that is adopting kind of an opportunity mindset, which I've been talking about a few times. So for me, the experience of slowing down time a little bit I've kind of embraced it. Like, oh, okay, you know, because I think like a lot of us, I had a lifestyle that was like go, 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 go. Craig is a colleague of mine, so I know, like, right, like you're always on the go before this, and so there's been something kind of nice about like, okay, no, I'm going to stay in Friday night and read a book, you know, and go to and be in bed by 10 p.m. and be, you know, at home. So there are some opportunities, I guess, to the slowdown. So that I think is going with the accordion. I love that metaphor from Alexa. That was really great. Okay, let's see this question from Jennifer. Do you think that permanent damage has been done to our society due to this pandemic? No, it's asking you to look in your crystal ball, but do you think that permanent damage has been done?
Well, I'll just say something very briefly, and then let Allison, who's been studying the effects of the pandemic per se, address it. I think there certainly have been permanent changes made, and whether those changes actually amount to damage, I think remains to be seen. But I don't think anybody looking at what we've all been through and the way our society has been changed could doubt or minimize the significance of things being different. And whether those differences, you know, I mean, we may look back on this and realize that we learned things from this and recalibrated relationships and recalibrated our professional commitments and so on in a way that we reflect on as positive. But you know, it's also very possible that we will look back on it and see things that were lost and things that were lost that couldn't be made up. And I think it remains, at least for me, an open question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, my first reaction to that question was, I don't want to answer that question. But I do, but I don't. So I imagine, I mean, I think, well, let me back up. Permanent damage has already been done. We've lost over 430,000 Americans. And there are those 430,000 or 440,000, whatever the number is now, Americans had families, and their families are dealing with the loss. So permanent damage has been done. Yes. Is it possible that we can come out of this and move forward in a more positive way? Absolutely. Absolutely. And there are silver linings that can come out of this. You know, one could argue that the fact that the pandemic, the cascading series of events that we experienced in 2020, that we're still dealing with today, opened up a period in American history with the Black Lives Matter movement, where the consciousness of many Americans has been raised to at least some degree to understand the roots of historical racism in America and its impact on people's lives from a day-to-day basis. And so to me, I can look at that and say that's a silver lining, in the sense that it's helping us contend with an issue that this country has needed to contend with for a very long time, to deal with a form of stress that chronic stress that people within different groups of society have experienced, especially the African American community and the Indigenous American community, the Latinx community, the Asian community has taken a hit with COVID being blamed. So I think our awareness about these kinds of issues has gone up, and I think that's a good thing. But I also think that there are other sources of silver lining that I would look for. We now have, you know, you were mentioning, Phil, that about, you know, reading your book on Friday night and going to bed. And, you know, we have, in our second survey, we actually included a series of questions, and we haven't analyzed them yet, but we're going to, about all of that, because people are talking about what are the positive things you've taken out of this pandemic. So there are people who have found a positive side to it. including sort of reimagining their lives, thinking about their lives in a different context, and thinking about, well, gosh, where do I want to take my life now? Do I want to go in this same direction that I've been going? Maybe I want to slow down and go a different path. That's a good thing for some people, to be able to have that time to reflect and think. The other thing that's good, I think that another positive aspect that's come out of this is telehealth. So we've got a switch in healthcare where we've now got the ability to reach out and provide healthcare services to people, including mental health and whatnot, through a medium of like Zoom or whatever it might be. And that has taken off like it had never taken off before, which means that there's greater access to the healthcare need. There's greater access to healthcare for people in need. So that's another positive thing that can come out of this to I don't want to say to undo the damage, because the damage has been done, and I imagine that there's still going to be more mental health and physical health sequelae to the pandemic that we're going to see. But I think if we can use our understanding of what our own strengths and look for some of those silver linings, whatever they might be, and use those to cope with the potential for mental health and physical health problems, we may actually be able to prevent some of it. We can prevent some of it by actually taking action now and really looking for those different positive frames, those different positive effects that we might be able to then use and manipulate toward mitigating the damage. And that's what I would say we need to be thinking about doing.
I just want to say one very brief thing, and Allison pointed out that the insurmountable loss of life, and the fact that there are people who've lost loved ones, and people who even the survivors of COVID are experiencing after effects. And I know there are a lot of people who've tuned in on this because they're undergoing really difficult experiences, and they want to get some guidance about what to do, and they're wondering whether there's something wrong with them, that they haven't been able to survive this without problems. We have, as a society, gone through a form of almost wartime trauma. If you think of the sheer loss of life that we have all been surrounded by, whether or not we've experienced it directly with family members, we've been exposed to it. The only thing comparable in our lifetimes is war. And we are all essentially, in that sense, survivors of that experience. And so there has been this level of collective trauma that we're enduring, and the isolation is part of it, the time distortion is part of it, but the sheer exposure to loss in a very, very focused short period of time. A year is a very short period of time. World War II lasted many years. We've lost as many people, and we're now losing more people in this much shorter period of time. And we've all been affected by that. And so, of course, we're all hurting, and of course, we're all traumatized by it. And we're all of us, in the same position of trying to figure out how to get to the next step of this, how to get to the next stage of this, and come out of this with our own psyches and our own society intact.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And with that, it is exactly 7 p.m. This has been a phenomenal opportunity, a real privilege to be here with both of you, experts and esteemed scholars, and our wonderful audience. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but they were wonderful questions. I'm so glad that's such a good audience. Great conversation. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Please join us March 9th for our next university forum. V is for Veracity, with Professor of Sociology Jenny Reardon, and moderated by Assistant Professor of Sociology James Doucette Battle. So good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.